In February 1943, Japan gambled the future of its New Guinea campaign on a convoy that many officers believed might never arrive. Nearly 7,000 soldiers were loaded onto 8 transports and escorted south toward LAE, one of the most important positions Japan still held in the Southwest Pacific. The mission was so dangerous that Japanese planners had already calculated the expected losses before the convoy even sailed. Half the ships, half the men. Those losses were considered acceptable, because without reinforcements, New Guinea could be lost. For 2 days, bad weather protected the convoy. Then the clouds cleared. American reconnaissance aircraft found the ships. Hours later, Allied bombers and fighters descended on the formation. What followed became one of the most devastating convoy disasters of the entire Pacific War. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, thousands of soldiers, destroyed in less than an hour. But the sinking of those ships was only the beginning. Years later, Japanese officers would argue that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a naval defeat. Some believed it was the moment Japan effectively lost New Guinea, and with it, any realistic chance of holding the Southwest Pacific. This is the story of a convoy that sailed despite the odds, the battle that annihilated it, and the decision that may have changed the course of the Pacific War forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy detailed World War II stories based on real events, consider subscribing. We upload new military history documentaries every day, and it helps the channel more than you might think. By February 1943, the war in the Southwest Pacific was beginning to turn against Japan. Only weeks earlier, Japanese forces had evacuated Guadalcanal, ending a campaign that had consumed thousands of men, hundreds of aircraft, and some of the finest crews in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Official statements described the withdrawal as a strategic adjustment. Few Japanese commanders saw it that way. The reality was becoming impossible to ignore. For the first time since the opening months of the war, Japan was no longer advancing across the Pacific. It was trying to hold what it had already gained. And nowhere was that challenge more urgent than New Guinea. Stretching across the northern coast of the island, Japanese positions formed a defensive shield protecting the approaches to Rabaul, one of Japan's most important bases in the South Pacific. If those positions collapsed, Allied forces would gain a direct path toward the heart of Japan's defensive network. At the center of that struggle stood the port of LAE. To Allied planners, LAE was simply another objective. To Japanese commanders, it was a lifeline. The harbor served as the primary gateway for troops, fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies moving into eastern New Guinea. Aircraft operating from nearby airfields helped defend Japanese positions throughout the region, while ground forces depended on the port to sustain their fight against advancing Australian units. Without LAE, Japan's entire position in eastern New Guinea could begin to unravel. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi understood the danger better than anyone. As commander of Japan's 18th Army, Adachi received increasingly alarming reports from the front. Units were suffering from disease, shortages of ammunition, and a growing lack of food. In some sectors, malaria was removing more soldiers from combat than Allied attacks. Something had to be done. There was only one solution available: reinforcements. At Rabaul, the veteran 51st Division was waiting for deployment. Nearly 6,000 soldiers, supported by artillery, vehicles, engineering equipment, ammunition, fuel, and supplies, were ready to move. Originally intended for another destination, the division was now redirected toward LAE as Japanese commanders searched for a way to stabilize the front before it was too late. But getting those men to New Guinea had become increasingly dangerous. American and Australian aircraft now dominated large sections of the sea routes between Rabaul and LAE. Allied reconnaissance aircraft regularly patrolled the area. Japanese communications were being intercepted. Convoys that had once sailed with relative safety were now being hunted. Japanese planners studied the risks and reached a disturbing conclusion. If a large convoy attempted the voyage, losses could be catastrophic. Some estimates suggested that as much as half the force might be lost before reaching its destination. Half the ships, half the soldiers. Japanese planners considered those losses acceptable, because the alternative seemed even worse. Without reinforcements, LAE might fall. Without LAE, New Guinea could be lost. And if New Guinea was lost, Japan's entire defensive position in the Southwest Pacific would become significantly weaker. The decision was made. 8 transport ships would carry the men and equipment of the 51st Division toward LAE. 8 destroyers would escort them. Together, they would transport nearly 7,000 soldiers and sailors through waters increasingly controlled by Allied air power. The convoy's commander was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, an experienced naval officer known for his calm professionalism. Kimura understood the risks as clearly as anyone involved in the operation. He knew Allied aircraft would almost certainly find the convoy. He knew losses were expected. Yet the orders remained unchanged. The convoy had to sail. On the night of February 28, 1943, the ship slipped out of Rabaul and formed into convoy order beneath the darkness of the Bismarck Sea. For the soldiers crowded below deck, the voyage represented a journey toward battle. For the commanders standing on the bridges, it represented a gamble that Japanese planners already believed might cost half the force before it reached New Guinea. And for the Allies, who were already searching the skies and seas around New Britain, it represented an opportunity. Within days, one of the most devastating convoy disasters of the Pacific War would begin. Shortly before midnight on February 28, 1943, the convoy slipped out of Rabaul and entered the darkness of the Bismarck Sea. 8 transport ships carried the men and equipment of the 51st Division. 8 destroyers formed the escort. Nearly 7,000 soldiers and sailors were packed aboard the formation. For many of the troops below deck, the voyage felt routine. They had spent months waiting for deployment. Now they were finally heading toward the front lines in New Guinea. The commanders on the bridges saw the situation differently. They knew the convoy was entering one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the Southwest Pacific. The Allied air forces based at Port Moresby had spent months improving their ability to locate and destroy Japanese shipping. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft regularly searched the sea routes between Rabaul and LAE. American intelligence officers were becoming increasingly effective at predicting Japanese movements. Every large convoy now risked discovery long before it reached its destination. That reality shaped the way the operation had been planned. The Japanese Army did not load the 51st Division onto a single transport or even a small number of ships. Instead, the division's men, equipment, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies were distributed across multiple vessels. The logic was simple. If one ship was sunk, the entire division would not be lost. The planners understood the danger. They were preparing for losses before the first attack had even occurred. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura understood the same thing. His mission was not to avoid combat. His mission was to deliver as much of the force as possible to New Guinea, even if several ships were lost along the way. For nearly 2 days, fortune appeared to favor the convoy. Storm systems moving across the region reduced visibility and limited Allied reconnaissance flights. Heavy cloud cover concealed the ships as they moved south along the coast of New Britain. Every hour that passed without discovery increased the possibility that the convoy might actually reach LAE. Then, on March 1st, the weather began to change. Clouds opened across parts of the route, visibility improved, and somewhere above the convoy, Allied aircraft were already searching. That afternoon, an American B-24 Liberator flying reconnaissance over the Bismarck Sea spotted the Japanese formation through a break in the clouds. The report was transmitted immediately. The convoy had been found, and once Allied aircraft knew its location, there was almost no chance it would remain hidden again. At Allied headquarters, commanders finally had the target they had been waiting for. For weeks, intelligence officers had tracked Japanese preparations at Rabaul. Aircraft had reported increased shipping activity. Radio intercepts suggested a major movement was being organized. Now the pieces finally came together. A large Japanese convoy was heading directly toward LAE. The response was immediate. Bomber units were alerted, attack plans were activated, pilots were briefed. The Japanese convoy was no longer simply sailing through dangerous waters. It had become the primary target of one of the largest Allied air attacks yet assembled in the Southwest Pacific. Meanwhile, aboard the transports, life continued much as it had the day before. Most soldiers knew nothing about the sighting. Below deck, the men of the 51st Division sat among crates of ammunition, fuel, supplies, and equipment that would be needed once they reached New Guinea. The compartments were crowded, hot, and uncomfortable, but morale remained relatively steady. Many believed they would soon be fighting on land. Few imagined they would be fighting for survival at sea. The officers responsible for the convoy had fewer illusions. Kimura understood that discovery changed everything. Once Allied aircraft knew the convoy's position, attacks were inevitable. The question was no longer whether American and Australian aircraft would come. The question was how many would come, and whether the convoy could survive what followed. Yet, despite the danger, Kimura maintained course. Turning back would mean abandoning the mission. The reinforcements were still needed. LAE still had to be held. The risks that existed before the convoy sailed still existed now. Nothing had changed except one critical fact. The Allies knew exactly where the convoy was. As darkness fell on March 1st, the ships continued south through the Bismarck Sea. The soldiers tried to sleep. The destroyer crews remained at their stations. And hundreds of miles away, Allied bomber crews prepared for the attack. The convoy had survived its first days at sea, but its greatest protection, secrecy, was gone. Hundreds of Allied airmen were already preparing for the strike. By the following afternoon, the first bombs would begin falling. The hunt had begun. Quick question before we continue. If you were Admiral Kimura, would you have continued toward LAE after the convoy was discovered, or turned back? Let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. The Japanese convoy had been discovered. Now the Allies needed to destroy it. On the morning of March 2, 1943, the convoy was still more than a day away from LAE. Despite being spotted the previous afternoon, Rear Admiral Kimura's formation remained largely intact. The weather that had protected the ships for much of the voyage continued to complicate Allied operations, and the Japanese still had reason to believe they might reach New Guinea. That hope began to disappear shortly before 10 a.m. High above the Bismarck Sea, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses approached the convoy. For Japanese sailors, this was a familiar threat. Throughout the Pacific War, high-altitude bombers had repeatedly attacked ships at sea. While dangerous, such attacks were far from unstoppable. Hitting a maneuvering ship from thousands of feet in the air was notoriously difficult, and Japanese commanders had seen convoys survive similar attacks before. Kimura ordered evasive maneuvers. The ships began turning independently. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The battle had begun. The B-17s released their bombs from high altitude. Most missed. Massive columns of water erupted around the convoy, drenching decks and shaking hulls. But for several tense moments, it appeared the Japanese escorts had judged the threat correctly. Then one bomb found its mark. The transport Kyokusei Maru took a direct hit. Loaded with nearly 1,000 soldiers of the 51st Division, the ship quickly began taking on water. Damage control teams fought to save her, but the situation deteriorated rapidly. Within a short time, the transport was doomed. As the ship settled lower into the sea, nearby destroyers rushed alongside to rescue survivors. The operation was surprisingly successful. Approximately 900 soldiers were pulled from the water before the transport finally disappeared beneath the waves. Among those rescued was Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commander of the 51st Division. His survival would prove important. The same could not be said for the division's equipment. Weapons, ammunition, vehicles, fuel, and supplies disappeared with the transport. The Japanese planners who had distributed equipment across multiple ships had anticipated exactly this possibility. The loss was serious, but it was not yet catastrophic. The system appeared to be working. One ship had been lost. The convoy continued. After completing the rescue operation, the destroyers carrying the survivors raced toward LAE, unloaded the rescued troops, and then turned around to rejoin the main convoy. It was an extraordinary effort. More importantly, it reinforced Kimura's confidence that the mission could still succeed. The convoy had taken its first loss, but it was still moving. 7 transports remained afloat. Thousands of soldiers were still heading toward New Guinea. Most of the supplies were still intact, and LAE was getting closer with every passing hour. As night approached, Kimura faced a decision. He could turn back, or he could continue toward LAE. The choice was never really in doubt. The entire purpose of the mission was to reinforce New Guinea despite expected losses. One sunk transport, while painful, did not change the strategic situation. The reinforcements were still needed. LAE still had to be held. The convoy continued south. That evening, many Japanese officers believed the worst might already be over. The convoy had survived its first major attack. The soldiers aboard the remaining transports had watched Allied bombers come and go without destroying the formation. For some, that seemed like proof the escort screen and fighter cover could protect them. What they did not know was that Allied commanders were already studying the results of the attack, and they had learned something important. High-altitude bombing alone was not enough. If the convoy was going to be destroyed, a different approach would be needed. Over the following hours, Allied aircraft gathered from bases across New Guinea. Bomber crews received new instructions. Fighter squadrons prepared for a type of attack most Japanese commanders had never encountered. The next day's assault would not resemble the one the convoy had just survived. It would be faster, it would be closer, and it would expose a fatal weakness in the way Japan defended its ships. By dawn on March 3rd, Kimura's convoy was approaching the Huon Gulf. LAE was now less than 100 miles away. For the men aboard the convoy, victory suddenly seemed possible. They had survived the first attack, they were approaching their destination, and the mission still appeared achievable. What they did not know was that Allied commanders had already found a way to destroy the convoy, and the weapon they were about to unleash would change the air war in the Pacific forever. By the morning of March 3rd, Rear Admiral Kimura believed his convoy still had a realistic chance of reaching LAE. The formation had survived the first day of attacks. 7 transports remained afloat. Most of the troops were still aboard. The destination was now less than 100 miles away. From the Japanese perspective, the operation was damaged, but far from defeated. What Kimura did not know was that Allied commanders had spent the previous year solving a problem that had frustrated air forces since the beginning of the war. How do you reliably sink moving ships from the air? Traditional high-altitude bombing had obvious limitations. Ships could maneuver. Wind could alter bomb trajectories. Even experienced bomber crews often missed their targets. The attack on March 2nd had demonstrated the problem perfectly. The convoy had been found. The convoy had been attacked. Yet only 1 transport had been sunk. For Allied planners, that result was not good enough. One of the men searching for a solution was Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, an American pilot and mechanic whose innovations would help create one of the most effective anti-shipping weapons of the Pacific War. Working in Australia, Gunn and his team began modifying B-25 Mitchell bombers in ways their designers had never intended. Additional machine guns were mounted in the nose. More guns were added along the fuselage. The aircraft became flying gunships capable of unleashing enormous volumes of fire directly ahead of them. But the guns were only part of the innovation. The real breakthrough was a technique known as skip bombing. The concept was surprisingly simple. Instead of releasing bombs from high altitude, pilots approached their targets at extremely low level, often just above the waves. The bomb would be released at high speed. It would skip across the surface of the water like a stone. Then it would slam into the side of the ship before detonating. The technique dramatically increased accuracy. More importantly, it attacked ships where they were most vulnerable, near the waterline. It also created a problem Japanese commanders had never faced before. Most naval anti-aircraft defenses were designed to engage aircraft approaching from above. The threat was expected to come from the sky. Skip bombers attacked from the horizon, sometimes lower than the mass of the ships they targeted. To make the attack even more effective, Allied planners developed a coordinated assault. First came aircraft that would force defenders to look upward. Then came aircraft that would attack from sea level. The objective was not merely to overwhelm the convoy, it was to confuse it, to force every Japanese gunner to look in the wrong direction. As dawn broke on March 3rd, dozens of Allied aircraft began moving toward Kimura's convoy. American B-25 Mitchells, Australian Beaufighters, B-17 bombers, fighters providing cover overhead. Together they formed one of the most carefully planned airstrikes yet assembled in the Southwest Pacific. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese ships, preparations focused on the threats commanders expected. Lookouts scanned the sky. Anti-aircraft crews stood ready. The destroyers maintained formation around the transports. Japanese doctrine assumed the attack would come from above. Everything about the convoy's defenses reflected that assumption. The escort ships carried experienced crews. The formation was correct. The guns were manned. Japanese fighter cover was available. On paper, Kimura possessed exactly the defenses Japanese naval doctrine required. The problem was that Allied planners already understood those defenses, and they had spent months designing a way around them. Shortly before 10 a.m., radar operators and lookouts reported approaching aircraft. The first formations appeared at medium altitude, exactly where Japanese commanders expected them to be. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, gunners tracked targets crossing the sky, lookouts focused upward. Every indication suggested that another conventional bombing attack was about to begin. It was precisely the reaction Allied planners wanted. Because while hundreds of Japanese eyes watched the sky above them, another group of aircraft was approaching from a direction few were watching at all. Just above the surface of the sea, racing toward the convoy at mast height. The trap was set, and within minutes the Battle of the Bismarck Sea would become one of the most devastating convoy disasters of the Pacific War. At approximately 10 a.m. on March 3, 1943, the attack began. For a brief moment, everything appeared to unfold exactly as Japanese commanders expected. Aircraft approached from medium altitude. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Lookouts tracked bombers crossing the sky. The convoy prepared for another conventional air raid. Then the Beaufighters arrived. Racing just above the waves, the Australian aircraft charged directly toward the convoy at extraordinary speed. Japanese sailors immediately opened fire, but something seemed wrong. The aircraft were not releasing torpedoes. They were not climbing to bomb. Instead, they continued straight toward the ships, firing their cannon and machine guns as they came. The attack achieved exactly what Allied planners intended. Many Japanese crews mistook the Beaufighters for torpedo bombers. To present a smaller target, some ships began turning toward the incoming aircraft. In doing so, they unknowingly exposed their broadsides to the next wave of attackers. At the same time, the Beaufighters swept across the convoy, raking decks, bridges, anti-aircraft positions, and exposed gun crews with devastating fire. Communication lines were severed. Weapons crews were killed or wounded. Command personnel were forced into cover. Within minutes, confusion spread throughout the formation. Then the B-25 Mitchells arrived. Flying at mast height, they raced toward the convoy from multiple directions. For many Japanese sailors, the aircraft appeared almost impossibly low. Some approached so close that individual crew members could be seen inside the cockpits. This was the moment Paul Gunn's tactics had been designed for. The Mitchells opened fire with their forward machine guns, suppressing anti-aircraft positions as they closed the distance. Then the bombs began falling. One after another, bombs skipped across the surface of the sea. Some bounced once, others twice. Then they slammed into the sides of transports and destroyers before exploding. The effect was immediate. The transport Teo Maru was struck and set ablaze. Moments later, Nojima Maru suffered multiple hits. Then another transport was hit, and another. Explosions erupted across the convoy. Columns of smoke climbed into the sky. Ships began slowing, turning, colliding, and drifting out of formation. What had been an organized convoy only minutes earlier was rapidly becoming a collection of isolated targets. The destroyers fought desperately to respond. Anti-aircraft guns continued firing. Crews maneuvered violently to avoid incoming attacks, but the assault came from every direction. Aircraft attacked from low altitude, others bombed from above, fighters strafed decks and gun positions. There was no opportunity to regain control. The destroyer Shirayuki, serving as Kimura's flagship, became one of the first major casualties. Hit repeatedly during the attacks, the ship suffered catastrophic damage. Explosions tore through the vessel. Fires spread rapidly. Eventually, the destroyer had to be abandoned. Other escorts soon found themselves facing similar disasters. The destroyer Arashio was heavily damaged while attempting to assist survivors. Several transports were left burning from bow to stern. Some sank quickly. Others remained afloat just long enough for more aircraft to arrive and finish the job. Ships were burning in every direction. By late morning, the convoy had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The battle had become a massacre. Transport crews jumped into the water to escape fires. Soldiers crowded lifeboats and rafts. Others simply leapt overboard as ammunition detonated behind them. The sea filled with wreckage, fuel, floating cargo, and thousands of men struggling to survive. Above them, Allied aircraft continued their attacks. Pilots later described ships burning from one end to the other. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. Entire vessels disappeared beneath the surface while aircraft were still making attack runs. The destruction was unlike anything many participants had witnessed before. What made the disaster even more remarkable was how quickly it occurred. The Japanese convoy had spent days crossing the Bismarck Sea. It took less than an hour for Allied aircraft to destroy it. By the time the final attack waves departed, 7 of the 8 remaining transports had been sunk or left sinking. Multiple destroyers had been destroyed or crippled. The reinforcement mission to LAE was effectively over. Rear Admiral Kimura survived the battle, but there was little he could do except rescue survivors and withdraw what remained of his shattered force. The gamble that Japanese planners had accepted before leaving Rabaul had ended in catastrophe. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were now drifting across the Bismarck Sea. Some clung to wreckage. Others floated among burning fuel and sinking ships. Many believed rescue would come. For thousands of them, it never would. By the afternoon of March 3rd, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was effectively over. The convoy no longer existed. The transports that had carried the 51st Division toward New Guinea were gone. Several destroyers had been sunk or crippled. Thousands of soldiers and sailors now found themselves floating in open water. For many survivors, the first challenge was simply staying alive. The sea was covered with wreckage. Broken lifeboats drifted among fuel slicks and debris. Men clung to planks, cargo crates, rafts, and anything capable of keeping them above the surface. Some had been thrown into the water by explosions. Others had jumped to escape burning ships. Many were exhausted before the struggle for survival had truly begun. Japanese destroyers immediately began rescue operations. Despite the danger of further air attacks, crews pulled as many survivors from the water as possible. Several destroyers packed their decks with rescued soldiers and sailors before withdrawing toward Rabaul. Thousands of men owed their lives to those efforts, but thousands more remained behind. For the survivors still drifting across the Bismarck Sea, uncertainty became the new enemy. Many expected additional rescue ships. Others hoped they could eventually reach land. Neither option was guaranteed. Strong currents scattered survivors across a vast area of ocean. Food and fresh water were almost non-existent. Wounds suffered during the air attacks went untreated. Every passing hour reduced the chances of survival. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft continued to patrol the area. One of the most controversial aspects of the battle emerged during these operations. Multiple Allied pilots later reported attacking lifeboats, barges, and concentrations of survivors in the water. The subject remains debated by historians. Some Allied commanders argued that survivors left alone could eventually reach New Guinea and return to combat. Others viewed the attacks as a continuation of the battle itself, intended to prevent enemy troops from rejoining the war. Regardless of the justification, the result was the same. The danger did not end when the ship sank. For many Japanese soldiers, the sea remained a battlefield. Days passed before the full scale of the disaster became clear. Rescue vessels recovered thousands of survivors. Others managed to reach shore after exhausting journeys through the water. Many never reached either. Some disappeared beneath the waves. Others succumbed to wounds, exhaustion, dehydration, or exposure. Precise casualty figures remained difficult to establish, but the losses were staggering. Of the nearly 7,000 troops and sailors who began the voyage, thousands were now dead. Entire units had ceased to exist. Vast quantities of equipment, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and supplies had vanished with the convoy. Yet the most important loss was not measured in ships. It was measured in capability. Thousands of Japanese soldiers eventually survived, but the convoy's mission had failed. The men who reached New Guinea arrived without much of the heavy equipment, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies they had been sent to deliver. The soldiers had survived. The reinforcement force had not. What Japanese commanders had hoped would stabilize the front instead became another burden on an already struggling supply system. And even as rescue operations continued, military leaders were beginning to understand the larger significance of the disaster. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was no longer being measured in ships sunk or lives lost. The true consequences would be felt on land. Because the battle had not merely destroyed a convoy, it had destroyed Japan's last realistic opportunity to reinforce New Guinea on the scale the campaign required, and the effects of that failure would soon be impossible to ignore. In the days following the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Japanese commanders began calculating the damage. The results were devastating. The transport force that had carried the 51st Division toward New Guinea had been virtually annihilated. Multiple destroyers had been sunk. Others had been heavily damaged. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were dead. Even many of those who survived arrived in New Guinea without the equipment they needed to fight. The material losses were equally severe. Vehicles disappeared beneath the sea. Artillery pieces vanished with the transports carrying them. Ammunition, fuel, engineering equipment, food, medical supplies, and communications gear were lost in enormous quantities. Many of these items could not be easily replaced. Japan's industrial capacity was already under growing pressure, while Allied submarines and aircraft were making every resupply operation more dangerous than the last. Yet the most significant consequence of the battle was not the destruction of the convoy itself. It was the lesson the Japanese high command drew from it. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that large troop convoys could no longer move safely through waters controlled by Allied air power. The methods that had supported Japan's early wartime expansion were becoming obsolete. Moving thousands of troops aboard large transport formations had become extraordinarily risky. Japanese commanders understood the implication immediately. Future reinforcements would have to move in smaller groups. Supplies would have to be transported in limited quantities. Operations that once required days could now take weeks, and some missions would become impossible altogether. For the soldiers already fighting in New Guinea, the consequences were immediate. The reinforcements intended to strengthen the front never arrived in the numbers originally planned. The supplies needed to support large-scale operations never reached their destination. As Allied forces continued advancing, Japanese units increasingly found themselves isolated, undersupplied, and dependent on shrinking stockpiles. The struggle for New Guinea gradually became a battle of logistics, and logistics favored the Allies. American and Australian forces possessed growing naval and air superiority. They could move men, equipment, and supplies with increasing efficiency. Japan faced the opposite problem. Every convoy risked destruction, every shipment became a gamble, every reinforcement operation required accepting losses before it even began. The imbalance widened month after month. Lieutenant General Adachi's forces would continue fighting with determination throughout the New Guinea campaign. In many cases, Japanese soldiers endured extraordinary hardship, but courage could not replace food, determination could not replace ammunition, and sacrifice could not replace the supplies resting on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. By the end of the war, many Japanese officers looked back on the battle as a turning point. Not because it was the largest naval defeat of the Pacific War, not because it produced the greatest number of casualties, but because it exposed a reality Japan could no longer ignore. The Allies had gained control of the air, and once that happened, the entire strategic situation changed. The convoy that departed Rabaul had been intended to save New Guinea. Instead, its destruction accelerated the campaign's collapse. The men aboard those transports never had the opportunity to fight the battle they had been sent to join. Many died at sea. Others reached shore without the equipment necessary to change the course of the campaign. The result was the same. The reinforcement effort failed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted only a matter of days. The destruction of the convoy took less than an hour, but the consequences would be felt across New Guinea for the rest of the war. A convoy sent to save a campaign had instead helped doom it. And for many historians, that is why the Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains one of the most important victories of the Pacific War. The Pacific War was filled with moments like this, decisions that changed entire campaigns in a matter of hours. If you enjoyed this story, check out the next documentary on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.